Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The first chill came on October 27th, a Tuesday. It was not the wholesome, crisp cold of an autumn evening, the kind that reddens cheeks and promises wood smoke. This was different. It was a pocket of winter, a fist of absolute zero that had taken root in the far corner of our backyard, near the old, crumbling stone wall that separated our property from the woods. I was raking leaves, a symphony of crimson and gold, piling them high for Jonathan to leap into. The air was mild, smelling of damp earth and decay. Then I took 3 steps toward the wall, and the warmth drained from the world. It was like walking through an invisible curtain into a walk-in freezer. The hairs on my arms stood up. My breath plumed, a tiny, shocked ghost in the October sun. I backed away, and the warmth returned, immediate and unsettling. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, a sinkhole for the day's heat. But there was no wind, and the cold felt deliberate. That was the first omen, though I did not recognize it as such. I was too preoccupied with the season, with the performance of normalcy. Our house, a Victorian with more gingerbread than substance, was dressed for the holiday. Pumpkins, plump and orange, sat on the porch steps. Synthetic cobwebs, gray and dusty, draped the hedges. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg from Emily S. Perpetual Baking fought a losing battle against the scent of wax from the jack-o'-lantern candles. We were playing house, you see, playing at being a happy family. The reality was that we were a tripod missing a leg, perpetually on the verge of collapse. Jonathan, our 8-year-old, had retreated into a silence that was far more frightening than any tantrum. His twin sister, Clara, had been the loud one, the bright one. Her absence was a physical weight in every room. The next day, the chill had grown. It was no longer a patch, but a stain, spreading from the stone wall toward the house. The grass within its boundary was stiff with frost, white and glittering, while the rest of the lawn remained merely damp. Jonathan, drawn by some childish curiosity, stood at its edge, his small hand outstretched. "Dante, John," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked at me, his eyes too old for his face. "It s were the cold lives, Dad." Emily came out then, wiping her hands on a towel. She saw Jonathan at the edge of the frost, and her smile, a fragile thing she wore for his benefit, vanished. "Devon, what is that?" "I don't know. Some kind of groundwater issue, maybe." The lie was ash in my mouth. Our neighbor, Logan, was in his own yard, staring at the same spot from his side of the fence. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no surprise, only a deep, weary resignation. He lived here for 70 years. He knew things. "Logan," I called over, "you ever see anything like this?" He shook his head slowly, but his gaze never left the frosted ground. "The ground remembering the cold," he said, his voice a dry rustle like dead leaves, or at S for getting the warmth. Hard to tell the difference, this close to Halloween. He finally looked at me, and there was a warning in his eyes. Things get thin this time of year. Best to leave well enough alone. But well enough had left us the moment Clara's heart stopped beating. Grief is a selfish thing. It does not care for warnings. It only cares for its own hunger. On the 29th, the pumpkins began to rot. It was not a natural softening, a gentle surrender to mold. It was a violent decay. The cheerful, toothy grins I had carved just days before sagged into leering, tortured screams. The flesh blackened and collapsed inward, and a sweet, cloying stench, like overripe fruit and spoiled meat, poured from them. Flies, fat and iridescent, gathered in buzzing clouds despite the cold. Emily, her hands trembling, gathered them up and threw them into the woods. But the smell lingered, a spectral presence on the porch. That night, I dreamed of the cold spot. In the dream, I was standing in it, and the frost was not on the grass but on my skin. The stones of the old wall were not random. They formed a low, circular pattern, like the rim of a well. And from that well, something was rising. Not a shape, not a form, but a sense of profound, sentient cold, a consciousness of absence. I woke shivering, the taste of copper and old soil in my mouth. Emily was asleep beside me, but her side of the bed was icy. The 30th was All Hallows' Eve, and the world felt stretched taut. The sky was a flat, featureless gray, and the enormous orange harvest moon that had dominated the nights before was now a pale, watchful ghost behind the clouds. Trick-or-treaters would be out in force the next night, but today was the calm before, the hush. Jonathan was in the backyard again, drawn to that cursed patch of earth. He had a small, plastic shovel and was poking at the frozen soil. "Jonathan, come away from there," I said, stepping out onto the porch. "I think something S buried here, Dad," he said, without looking up. His voice was matter-of-fact. Something wants out. A jolt of something fear, or perhaps a terrible, forbidden hope went through me. I walked toward him, the air growing colder with each step. I looked down where he was digging. The frost had hardened the earth, but he had managed to scrape away a thin layer. Beneath it, the soil was not brown, but a strange, pale gray. And there, just peeking through, was a smooth, white curve. Not a rock. Bone. My breath caught. It was an animal, it had to be. A dog, a deer. But the shape was too familiar, too perfect. It was the dome of a human skull. "Clara," Jonathan whispered. The world tilted. "No, son. No, it's not her." My voice was a strangled thing. Clara was buried in the manicured lawn of St. Mary S. Cemetery, 20 miles away, under a headstone of pink marble. But what if she wasn't he? What if a piece of her, some essential part, had been drawn here? What if this ground, this cold, thin place, was a door? The thought was a madness, a poison, and I drank it greedily. I sent Jonathan inside, my hands shaking. As dusk began to bleed into the landscape, turning the world into a study in orange and black, I found myself back at the stone circle with a real shovel. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. I dug. I dug with a frantic, desperate energy. The sound of the metal striking frozen earth, a jarring counterpoint to the distant, happy shrieks of children playing in the twilight. I dug until my back ached and my hands were raw. And I found them. Not just one skeleton. A dozen, maybe more. They were stacked haphazardly, a communal grave. The bones were old, stained the same gray as the earth, and they were small. So small. A child's burial ground. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was the secret. This was the source of the cold. The land was not just remembering the cold, it was remembering the dead. And on Halloween, when the veil was at its thinnest, it had the power to give them back. Logan was at the fence, watching me. Didn't he look angry? He looked defeated. They were the first settlers' children, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A fever took them, all in one terrible winter. They buried them here, consecrated it themselves. The ground had accepted the offering. It learned the taste of young death. And once a year, it gets hungry. It gets ambitious. It can bring them back. I asked, the question a blasphemy. It can make a copy, Logan corrected, his eyes bleak. A hollow thing, wearing a face you love, fed by memory and grief. It is a transaction, Devon. It gives you back a shadow, and it takes a piece of the living world in return. It makes everything a little colder, a little deader. It is why the winters get longer here. It is why the leaves turn so bright they race screaming. I looked at the bones in the pit. I thought of Clara's laugh, the way she would curl up in my lap, the specific weight of her. A hollow copy would be better than this nothing. Wouldn't he it? Don't do it, son, Logan pleaded. It is not her. It will never be her. And the cost is the rest of us. But I wasn't listening. Grief is a louder voice than reason. I was already planning. I would need something of hers. A focus. The ground was ready. It was Halloween Eve. The door was already ajar. That night, the house was a tomb. Emily knew I was hiding something, a secret that made my eyes glitter with a feverish light. Jonathan watched us both, a silent sentinel. I waited until they were asleep. Then I went to Clara's room. It was a shrine, preserved exactly as she had left it. I took her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hops, from the pillow. It still smelled faintly of her shampoo. The moon was high, a bleached skull in the sky when I went back into the yard. The cold was intense now, a physical pressure. The jack-o'-lanterns on neighboring porches seemed to watch me with their flickering, hellish gazes. I stood at the edge of the stone circle, the stuffed rabbit clutched in my hand. The air hummed with a silent, ancient power. This was a ritual older than trick-or-treating, older than costumes. This was the original magic of Samhain, the desperate plea to the dead. I stepped into the circle. The cold did not just touch me, it entered me. It flowed into my lungs, my blood, my bones. My teeth chattered uncontrollably. I knelt in the center of the stones, over the open grave of children, and placed Mr. Hops on the frozen ground. "Please," I whispered, the word tearing itself from my frozen throat. "Bring her back." For a long moment, nothing. Only the profound, listening silence of the night. And then the ground beneath my knees began to warm. It was a dreadful, unnatural heat, like feverish flesh. The frost on the grass melted instantly, steaming. The gray soil darkened, becoming rich and black. And from that fertile, terrible earth, something began to grow. It was not a body rising from the grave. It was a body being woven. Thin, pale roots, like those of a willow, pushed up from the soil, knitting together, twisting, forming a skeleton. Tendrils of ivy, dark and veined, wrapped around the bone structure, weaving muscle and sinew. Fallen leaves, crimson and orange, swirled up from the yard and plastered themselves onto the form, creating a patchwork of skin. Finally, from the empty socket of the skull, a single fat pumpkin vine emerged, unfurling a flower that was not a flower, but a perfect, carved jack-o'-lantern face. It was Clara S. face, her smile, her wide, innocent eyes. The thing stood up. It was my daughter S. height, my daughter S. shape. It smelled of damp earth, rotting pumpkins, and a faint, ghostly hint of strawberry shampoo. "Daddy," it said, and the voice was hers. A perfect copy, but the eyes were wrong. Behind the carved pumpkin rind, in the darkness of the sockets, was not the warm brown of Clara S. eyes, but the absolute black of a starless midnight, a cold that predated the sun. I reached out a trembling hand. The thing that wore my daughter S. face took it. Its touch was like holding a handful of wet, cold soil. I led it toward the house. I was a god and a monster. I had cheated death. I had broken the world. Inside, Emily was standing at the top of the stairs. She saw the thing holding my hand, and a sound escaped her. A whimper of pure, unadulterated terror. The thing looked up at her and smiled its jack-o'-lantern smile. "Hi, Mommy." Emily backed away, her hand flying to her mouth. Then Jonathan S. door creaked open. He stood there, small and pale in his pajamas. He looked at the thing, at its leafy skin and pumpkin head. He didn't scream. He just said, very quietly, "That S not Clara." The thing S head swiveled toward him. The friendly carved smile seemed to sharpen, to become a gash of predatory glee. "Yes, I am silly," it chirped. "I am back." The next few hours were a slow-motion nightmare. We sat in the living room, the four of us, and the fifth thing. It sat in Clara S.'s favorite chair, its legs not quite touching the floor. It talked in Clara S.'s voice, recalled Clara S. memories. But its movements were subtly wrong, a series of jerks and pauses, as if it was being operated by strings. And it was cold. A palpable chill radiated from it, leaching the warmth from the room. The vibrant orange of its pumpkin head seemed to absorb the light, not reflect it. "I am hungry," it said after a while. "Can I have some candy?" It was Halloween. Of course there was candy. Emily, moving like an automaton, brought the big ceramic bowl from the kitchen, filled with miniature chocolate bars and shiny, wrapped sweets. The thing took a piece, its fingers twigs wrapped in leaf skin fumbling with the wrapper. It didn't eat it. It just held the chocolate in its palm, and we watched, horrified, as the candy seemed to wither, its colors fading, until it crumbled into a gray, dusty powder. The thing was not eating the candy. It was consuming its essence, its sweetness, its life. Yummy, it said, and the black eyes within the pumpkin gleamed. The doorbell rang. Trick-or-treaters. My blood ran colder than the thing's touch. Emily and I looked at each other. A silent, frantic communication. We couldn't answer it. We couldn't let anyone see what was in our living room. The doorbell rang again, insistent. Then a small, muffled voice called out, "Trick or treat." The thing in the chair tilted its head. "They ray here for me," it said happily. And before we could stop it, it scrambled down and ran to the door. Its movements were faster now, more fluid. It was learning. It pulled the door open. On the porch stood a group of children, a ghost, a superhero, a witch. Their parents waited on the sidewalk. The children held out their bags, their cheerful cries dying in their throats as they saw what had answered the door. The thing that was not Clara stood there, its pumpkin head glowing from the candlelight within, its body a tapestry of autumn decay. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the witch, a little girl of about 6, screamed. It was not a playful shriek, but a raw, primal sound of terror. The thing on the porch laughed. It was Clara's laugh, but distorted, run through a filter of rustling leaves and crumbling earth. It reached into our candy bowl, took a handful, and dropped the dusty, gray treats into the witch's bag. "Happy Halloween," it crooned. The children fled, their costumes blurring as they ran back to their parents. Their night of fun irrevocably poisoned. We closed the door, locking it, shutting out the world. The thing turned to us, its carved smile serene. "They liked my costume," it said. That was when the real change began. The thing was no longer content to sit. It moved through the house, and wherever it went, the Halloween decorations responded. The plastic skeletons hanging in the corners seemed to shift their poses when we weren't looking. The synthetic cobwebs grew thicker, gathering real dust, real flies. The smiling, cardboard black cat on the mantel seemed to snarl. Our home was becoming an extension of it, a part of its hollow, decaying reality. I looked out the window. The street was emptying. Porch lights were winking off, one by one. The festive atmosphere was curdling into something fearful and watchful, and the cold was spreading. I could see a shimmer of frost creeping from our yard onto the sidewalk, then into the street. It was following the path of the terrified trick-or-treaters, a blight spreading through the neighborhood. Logan had been right. The cost was the rest of us. Jonathan was crying, silent tears tracking through the freckles on his cheeks. Emily held him, her own face a mask of horror and accusation. She looked at me, and I saw the truth in her eyes. I had done this. My grief, my selfish, unbearable grief, had opened the door. "You have to put it back, Devon," she whispered, her voice cracking. The thing heard her. It stopped its pacing and turned its pumpkin head toward us. The friendly smile was gone. The carved lines had shifted just slightly into something petulant and cruel. "Put what back?" it asked, its voice dropping, losing the cadence of a child. Now it sounded like the earth itself, grinding stones together. "I live here now." It started toward Jonathan. "My brother is sad. I can make him happy. I can make him like me. Stay away from him." Emily screamed, pulling Jonathan behind her. The thing kept coming, its twig fingers reaching. The air around it grew so cold that the moisture in the air crystallized into a swirling mist of ice. I moved without thinking. I grabbed the fireplace poker, a heavy iron rod. "Stop," I commanded, my voice trembling. The thing looked at the poker, then at me. It laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You can hurt me, Daddy. You made me. I am yours." It was right. I had made it. I had called it from the thin place with my love and my loss. But love was not the only powerful emotion. I looked at Emily, at the terror in her eyes. I looked at Jonathan, my living son, and I felt a new emotion, cold and sharp and clear. A father-s rage, a protector-s fury. "You are not mine," I said, and my voice was steady now. "You are a parasite, a weed, and I am going to rip you out by the roots." I swung the poker. It did not try to dodge. The iron bar smashed into its pumpkin head. There was a wet, crunching sound. A fissure snaked across the orange rind, and from within, not candlelight, but that same absolute blackness poured out, a smoke of pure cold. The thing shrieked, a sound that was not human, not animal, but the sound of tearing roots and freezing stone. It stumbled back, clutching its broken face. "You'll be cold forever." It wailed. "You'll all be so cold." I advanced on it, swinging the poker again, this time at its legs. The twig bones snapped like kindling. The thing collapsed, a pile of leaves and broken branches and oozing black sap. It writhed on the floor, its form beginning to unravel. The leaves browned and crumbled. The ivy withered. The pumpkin head deflated, the carved features sagging into a grotesque, melting mask. But the cold intensified, a final, spiteful act. The windows frosted over completely, etching strange, dendritic patterns on the glass. The walls themselves seemed to sweat ice. I grabbed the remains, the crumbling, freezing mass of it, and dragged it toward the back door. Emily, finding a reserve of strength, helped me, her face set in a grimace of revulsion. We hauled it out into the yard, back toward the stone circle. The burial ground was waiting. The earth was black and hungry. We threw the thing that was not Clara into the pit, onto the bed of small, gray bones. For a moment, it lay there, the black eyes in the shattered pumpkin still fixed on me with infinite hate. Then the soil began to move. It flowed over the thing like a liquid, pulling it down, swallowing it. There was a final, deep sigh, like the earth itself was catching its breath. And then silence. The cold did not vanish. It lessened, retreating back to the stone circle, but a remnant of it remained, a permanent scar on the air. The neighborhood was quiet. No more doorbells, no more laughter. The only sound was the wind, a lonely, hollow sound through the bare branches. We went back inside. We held Jonathan between us on the couch, under a blanket, trying to share what little warmth we had left. We did not speak. There were no words for what had happened, for what I had done. The tension gradually loosened until it faded into a neutral description. The morning of November first dawned, gray and cold. The frost on our lawn was a little whiter, a little thicker than on the other lawns. The few remaining pumpkins on the street were collapsed, black husks. Our own porch was bare. We would never carve a jack-o'-lantern again. The children who came to our door next Halloween would find the house dark, the porch light off, a silent monument to the cost of disturbing what should sleep. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind blows from the woods, I can still feel it, a concentrated spot of winter in the backyard, a place where the dead children play, waiting for another grieving soul to listen, to invite them in, and to learn too late that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. The cleanup was a silent, grim affair. We burned the blanket we had wrapped ourselves in, the fibers holding a chill that no fire could seem to erase. We scrubbed the floor where the thing had unraveled, but a dark, greasy stain remained in the grain of the wood, and the air above it always tasted of turned soil. Emily and I moved around each other like ghosts, our conversations reduced to practicalities. The unspoken thing hung between us, a wall of ice I had built with my own hands. Jonathan stopped talking altogether. He would sit for hours, staring at the frosted patterns on the window, his small hands resting limply in his lap. The doctor called it shock, a natural response to trauma. Didn't he understand that the trauma was not just what we had seen, but what I had done? I had not only summoned a monster, I had shown my son that his father's love could be a destructive, reckless force. A week after Halloween, Logan came to the door. He looked older, the lines on his face etched deeper by the recent cold. He ask to come in, just stood on the porch, his gaze drifting past me to the backyard. "The frost line is receding," he said, his voice low. "But it stopped at your property line. It's anchored here now. You gave it a foothold." "I know," I said, the words ash in my mouth. "It won't be as easy for the next person," he continued. "The ground is sated for now. But the hunger is a lesson it learned well. It will wait. It's good at waiting." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were not accusing, just terribly tired. "You have a son who needs you. Be his father. That's your penance." He turned and walked away, leaving me with the truth of it. My penance was not in grand gestures or further rituals. It was in the small, daily act of rebuilding what I had broken. I started with Jonathan's room. I took down the posters of planets and rockets, which felt like relics from another lifetime, and together we painted the walls a warm, buttery yellow. We didn't talk much, but our shoulders brushed as we worked. And once, when my hand slipped and I got a streak of paint on my cheek, I saw the faintest ghost of a smile on his face. Emily watched us from the doorway, her arms crossed. The thaw between us was slower, a glacier grinding its way toward the sea. But one night, I came home from work to find she had packed up Clara's room. Not everything, just the clothes, the school books, the daily reminders. Mr. Hops was gone. The room was now just a room, spare and clean, holding its breath. Winter came in earnest, laying a thick blanket of snow over the land. The spot in the backyard where the stone circle lay was always the first to hold the snow and the last to let it go. A perfect white circle on the brown grass of early spring. We never went near it. We never spoke of it. We simply let it be. Months later, on a warm evening in May, I was grilling burgers on the patio. Jonathan was kicking a soccer ball against the fence, the rhythmic thump, a sound of ordinary life. Emily was setting the table, humming a tune I hadn't heard in years. The world was green and alive again. Then Jonathan's ball veered off course, rolling straight toward the stone circle. He ran after it, his laughter dying as he approached the edge of that consecrated ground. He stopped, staring down at the grass, which was still slightly paler, slightly thinner there. I held my breath, the spatula frozen in my hand. He didn't reach for the ball. He just looked at it, then back at me. His eyes, so much older now, met mine. He understood the line. He understood the cost. He turned his back on the circle and walked toward me, leaving the ball where it lay. "I am hungry, Dad," he said, his voice clear and firm. And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of cooking food and the sounds of a peaceful evening, I knew we would be okay. We were scarred, we were changed, but we were together. We had learned to live with the cold spot in our yard and the colder one in our past, building a new warmth around it, a careful, cherished fire that we would tend for the rest of our days. The door was still ajar, a sliver of darkness at the edge of our world, but we had finally learned not to look inside. I flipped the burgers, the sizzle a comforting, normal sound. We ate at the patio table as the fireflies began to blink in the gathering dusk. They danced over the lawn, but none ventured near the stone circle. That patch of the yard remained a void, a pocket of stillness that even the insects avoided. Later, as I was putting the grill cover on, I saw a single, determined dandelion had pushed its way up through the soil right at the edge of the stones. Its yellow head was a brave, foolish speck of color against the gloom. Part of me wanted to pull it, to maintain the purity of the border, but I left it. Let it live, I thought. Let something innocent and stubborn grow there. It was a small defiance, a tiny ward against the despair that place represented. That night, for the first time since Halloween, Emily reached for me in her sleep. Her hand found mine on the mattress, her fingers lacing through mine. wasn't an invitation, not yet, but it was a bridge. Her skin was warm. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing and the wind in the trees, holding onto that simple human contact as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored to the world. The next morning, I went into the garage and found the box of Clara's things that Emily had packed. I carried it down to the basement and placed it on a high shelf, not hiding it, but putting it away. It was no longer a shrine, but an archive, a part of our history, painful and beloved, that we would not forget, but would no longer let dictate our present. Life, in its mundane and miraculous way, began to fill the spaces the horror had vacated. Jonathan started drawing again, his pictures no longer of dark shapes and pumpkin faces, but of rockets and dinosaurs. He still had nightmares, and sometimes he would climb into our bed, his small body trembling. We would make room for him, a tangle of limbs and shared warmth, and eventually his breathing would slow and deepen into sleep. The following October, as the air turned crisp and the stores filled with candy and costumes, a new kind of tension settled over the house. We didn't decorate. We didn't buy a pumpkin. We made a plan. We would go to a movie on Halloween night, the brightest, loudest, most animated film we could find. We would be gone before the trick-or-treaters began their rounds. On the 31st, as we were getting ready to leave, the doorbell rang. We all froze, looking at each other. The sound was a trigger, a gunshot from the past. Jonathan S.'s face went pale. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was a little girl, dressed as a princess, her father standing a few paces back on the sidewalk, smiling. They were just people, normal people having a normal night. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. I just stood there, my forehead against the cool wood, until I heard them walk away, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. We went to the movie. We ate too much popcorn. We laughed at the silly jokes. And when we came home, the house was silent and dark, exactly as we had left it. The holiday had passed us by. It was a victory, small and sad, but a victory nonetheless. I stood at the living room window, looking out at the night. The neighborhood was quiet, the frenzy of the evening over. My reflection was faint in the glass, a ghost superimposed over the yard. And for a single, heart-stopping second, I thought I saw another face reflected beside mine. A small, round face with a carved smile and eyes of deepest black. It was there, and then it was gone, leaving only my own weary expression. It was just my imagination, a trick of the light, and a scar on my mind. I knew that. But I also knew that some things, once invited in, never truly leave. They just learn to wait in the silence, in the cold spots, in the corners of your vision, patient as stone. I turned from the window, the image seared onto my retina. I would not give it power by speaking of it. I checked the locks, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing, and went upstairs. Emily was already in bed reading. She looked up as I entered. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said, and for the first time It felt mostly true. The years that followed were a study in careful living. We celebrated birthdays, went on vacations, argued about homework and chores. We were a family, but our world had a permanent fence around it, an invisible boundary we all respected. We never went camping. We never visited old cemeteries for fun. And we never, ever celebrated Halloween. Jonathan grew into a quiet, observant teenager. He had his mother's eyes and a stillness about him that sometimes worried me. On his 16th birthday, he asked for a car. It was a normal request, and we saved for it, a tangible goal in our carefully constructed normal life. The day we bought it, a used sedan, he was ecstatic. He washed it in the driveway, the water sluicing off the shiny blue paint. I watched him from the porch, my chest swelling with a pride that was no longer fragile. That evening he came to me, his keys jangling in his hand. "I'm going for a drive, just around, to test it out." "Be careful," I said, the automatic parental response. He nodded, but he hesitated at the door. "Dad," he said, not meeting my eyes. I was thinking, maybe I'd drive out to Miller's Point, look at the stars. The air went out of me. Miller's Point was a lookout high on a ridge, miles from town. It was also the place where Logan, the previous owner of our house, had told me he first felt the thinness in his youth. It was a place where the veil was said to be delicate. All my instincts screamed to forbid it, to lock the doors and keep him safe within our walls. But I looked at my son, nearly a man, who had lived his entire life in the shadow of a terror he did not choose. He was testing his own boundaries and mine. I walked over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "The stars will be bright up there," I said, my voice tight. "Take a jacket. It gets cold." He looked at me then, and I saw the understanding in his gaze. He knew what I was really saying. He knew the risks, and he knew I trusted him to navigate them. It was the greatest gift I could give him. He left. The house felt cavernous without him. Emily came and stood beside me, slipping her hand into mine. We didn't speak. We just waited. An hour later, his car pulled back into the driveway. He came inside, his cheeks flushed with the night air. "It was okay," he said simply. "The stars were amazing. And then, I just felt like coming home." Relief washed over me, so profound it felt like a physical warmth. He had gone to the edge, looked into the abyss, and chosen to turn back. He had chosen us and the life we had built. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in years. The past was not gone. The cold spot in the yard remained, a permanent fixture we mowed around. The memory of that twisted pumpkin smile was a part of my bones, but the fear had lost its teeth. We had not conquered it. We had simply learned to live alongside it, and in doing so, we had reclaimed our lives. The door was still there, a crack open to the other side. But we had finally learned that we held the key, not to lock it, but to choose every single day not to walk through the next spring. We did something we had never done before. We planted a garden, not flowers, but vegetables. Tomatoes, zucchini, green beans. It was Emily's idea. She said she wanted to put down roots, the good kind. We tilled the soil on the far side of the yard, as far from the stone circle as we could get. The earth there was dark and rich, and it felt like an act of rebellion to bury seeds in it and expect life to come back. Jonathan, now 17, helped without being asked. He was the one who built the simple wooden trellis for the beans. As he hammered the pieces together, the solid, repetitive thuds were a comforting sound. We worked until our hands were dirty and our backs ached, and it was the best kind of tired. The garden thrived. By July, we were harvesting more tomatoes than we could eat. The vibrant red of them against the green leaves was a shock of color in our world, a world that had felt so monochrome for so long. Emily started making sauce, filling the house with the smell of garlic and basil. It was a new kind of ritual, one of abundance and care. One evening, as we were weeding, Jonathan paused, sitting back on his heels. He looked toward the stone circle. The dandelion I had seen years before had started a small colony, a ring of yellow around the stones that the lawnmower always avoided. "It doesn't feel as hungry anymore," he said quietly. I followed his gaze. He was right. The malevolence had faded, replaced by a simple, profound sadness. It was no longer a maw, but a grave. The thing we had buried there was not just a monster. It was a collection of lost children, their stolen innocence and stolen futures. Our anger had subsided, leaving behind a quieter, more enduring grief. No, I agreed. It doesn't. We never spoke of forgiveness. Not for the thing that wore our daughter's face, and not for me, for my role in summoning it. Some acts are beyond that. But we learned a different language, one of shared glances over a dinner table, of a hand on a shoulder when one of us grew quiet, of the simple, steadfast presence of people who have seen the worst and have chosen to stay. The cold spot is still there. On winter mornings, the frost patterns on that part of the lawn are still more intricate, more beautiful, and more terrible than anywhere else. I sometimes stand at the window and watch the sun hit it, making the ice crystals glitter like a field of fallen stars. It is a part of our home, a part of our story, a reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that the deepest wounds can, with time and care, become scars. And scars, while they mark the site of an injury, also prove that you have healed. The summer Jonathan graduated high school, we held a party in the backyard. It was Emily's idea, a final, decisive act of reclamation. We strung lights from the patio to the oak tree, careful to keep the celebration on our side of the invisible line. His friends came, their laughter loud and unself-conscious, their music filling the air. For a few hours, the yard felt ordinary, just a place where people gathered to celebrate. I watched from the porch as Jonathan talked with his friends, his posture easy, his smile genuine. He caught my eye and gave me a small nod. He understood the significance of the party, too. We were not pretending the past didn't exist. were simply choosing to build over it. Later, as the party wound down, one of the balloons escaped its tether and drifted toward the stone circle. It bounced once, twice, on the pale grass, then came to a rest against the largest stone. Everyone was too busy saying their goodbyes to notice. Everyone but me. I watched it, a shiny blue orb against the gray rock, and waited for the familiar dread to clench in my stomach. It didn't come. There was only a quiet, watchful stillness from that part of the yard. The balloon, after a moment, deflated with a soft sigh, collapsing into a scrap of latex. The next month, we helped Jonathan pack for college. He was going only 2 states away, a manageable distance. As we carried boxes to his car, I felt the old fear stirring, the one that whispered of thin places and hungry things waiting in the dark. I wanted to warn him, to give him a list of rules, to make him promise to never be alone in the woods, to never answer a strange voice in the night. But I held my tongue. He was not a little boy anymore, and the world was full of its own ordinary dangers. He had to learn to navigate them. The greatest protection I could offer him was not a set of restrictions, but the knowledge that he was strong enough to face what came. The night before he left, we sat together on the back steps. The air was warm, carrying the scent of cut grass and the distant hum of traffic. "You know," he said, his gaze fixed on the dark shape of the stone circle, "I don't think it es waiting for anything anymore. I think it es just sleeping." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it es just that we ray not listening." He considered this, then nodded. That es probably the same thing. The following morning, we hugged him goodbye in the driveway. Emily cried, but they were clean tears, proud and sad all at once. I clapped him on the back, my throat too tight for words. He got in his car and drove away toward his future. I put my arm around Emily, and we stood there long after his car had disappeared from view. The house felt large and empty again, but it was a different kind of empty. It was the emptiness of a job well done, of a chapter closing. We went back inside. The silence was no longer oppressive, but contemplative. I walked to the living room window and looked out at the backyard. The sun was high, bleaching the pale grass around the stones. It was just a patch of land now, a quirk of the property. The fear was gone. The grief remained, but it was a soft, familiar weight, like a stone worn smooth by a river. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed, but you can learn to live in the house with them. You can hang a picture on them, or simply walk past them every day without a second glance. The darkness behind them becomes just another part of the architecture, a silent tenant you have made your peace with. And in that peace, you find a freedom that is deeper and more hard-won than any innocence you lost. I made 2 cups of tea and brought one to Emily. She was in the living room, holding a photo of the 3 of us, taken before Clara was born. She took the mug with a small, grateful smile. "It is quiet," she said. "It is," I agreed. We sat in that quiet for a long time. It wasn't the silence of waiting or of dread. It was the silence of a house resting, of a story continuing on its way. The world outside the window was green and ordinary. The stone circle was just a ring of rocks in the lawn. The past was a story we had told, and the future was a page we were finally ready to turn. We sipped our tea, and the sun moved slowly across the floor, and for the first time in almost 2 decades, the house felt truly, completely, and peacefully our own. A week after Jonathan left, I found myself in the basement, looking for an old toolbox. My eyes drifted to the shelf where Clara S. box sat. It was dusty. I didn't feel the need to take it down. It was enough to know it was there. Emily started painting again. She set up an easel in the corner of the living room, where the light was best. Her first painting was of the garden, the tomatoes a brilliant, almost violent red against the deep green. She didn't paint the other side of the yard. One evening in late September, the doorbell rang. We both flinched, a conditioned response that was slowly fading. It was a neighbor, a new young woman who had just moved in down the street. She was holding a flyer for a block party. "We're trying to get to know everyone," she said cheerfully. Emily took the flyer. "We'll try to make it," she said, and I knew she meant it. The day of the block party was unseasonably warm. We walked down the street, holding hands. People greeted us. We ate grilled hot dogs and potato salad. We talked about the weather, about our jobs, about Jonathan being away at college. It was all so normal it felt surreal. The sun was warm on my skin, and for a few hours, I forgot about the cold spot entirely. When we returned home, the house felt different. It was no longer a fortress, but simply a house on a street with other houses. We had crossed a threshold we hadn't even known was there. That winter was mild. The cold spot in the yard was still there, a perfect circle of white frost on the mornings when the rest of the lawn was merely damp. But it seemed smaller, as if the world around it was slowly, imperceptibly, warming it from the edges. Jonathan came home for Christmas, his duffel bag full of dirty laundry and new ideas. He seemed older, more sure of himself. He asked about the block party. He told us about his classes. He never once looked out the back window with anything but a passing glance. On New Year's Eve, the 3 of us stayed up until midnight. We drank sparkling cider and watched the fireworks on television. When the clock struck 12, we hugged. It was a new year. It felt like a true beginning. Later, as I was turning off the lights, I saw a single firefly, a lone, blinking ember in the deep winter cold, drifting over the stone circle. It was impossible, a trick of the eye. But it blinked once, twice, and then winked out. I didn't tell anyone. Some moments are just for you, a secret sign that the world is both stranger and more resilient than you can ever know. I went upstairs and got into bed beside my wife. The house was quiet, and we slept through the night. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Emily was already in the kitchen, humming. Jonathan was at the table, scrolling through his phone. The scene was so mundane it was beautiful. I poured a cup of coffee and joined them. We talked about nothing in particular, the easy chatter of a family at ease. A few days after Jonathan returned to school, I was raking the last of the autumn leaves. My rake scraped against a stone, and I looked down. It was one of the smaller rocks from the circle, somehow pushed out onto the grass. It was just a rock, gray and unremarkable. I thought about putting it back. I even bent down and picked it up. It was cold, but no colder than the morning air. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight. Then I walked over to the edge of the woods and threw it as far as I could into the trees. I heard it land with a soft thud in the thick layer of leaves. I didn't feel a shift in the air. There was no sudden chill. I just went back to my raking. When I told Emily what I had done, she simply nodded. "It was just a rock," she said. And she was right. The circle was broken now, a gap in its perfect geometry. The pattern was disrupted. The next time it frosts, I think, the cold spot might not be a perfect circle anymore. It might be something else, something less defined, something that can eventually be mowed over. The past is not a cage. It is a story, and we are no longer just characters in it. We are the authors, and we are writing new chapters in a house that is finally, completely, a home. The silence now is not something to be feared, but something to be filled with the sounds of our lives, our choices, our peace. The spring after I threw the stone away, the dandelions in the yard grew more numerous. They sprouted in cheerful, random clusters, their yellow heads dotting the green. Emily didn't pull them. She said they were stubborn, and she liked that about them. One Saturday, I was mowing the lawn, and for the first time, I didn't steer carefully around the pale grass. I pushed the mower right over it. The blades whirred, cutting the dandelion stems and leaving a neat, if slightly paler, square of grass behind. Nothing happened. The earth did not open. The only sound was the mower's engine and the distant call of a robin. That summer, we got a dog. A small, scruffy terrier mix from the shelter. Jonathan named him Scout. Scout had no sense of boundaries. He dug holes in the vegetable garden and chased squirrels across the stone circle without a hint of hesitation. He would lie in the sun on that very spot, his belly exposed, sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of an animal. Watching him, I felt the last lingering knot of tension in my shoulders finally begin to loosen. Emily finished her painting of the garden and started a new one. This one included the oak tree, and the edge of the stone circle was visible in the background, a soft gray smudge beneath the dappled light. It was not hidden. It was just part of the landscape. Jonathan calls every Sunday. He talks about his classes, his friends, a girl he's dating. His voice is full of a future that is entirely his own. He asked about Scout, about the garden, about how the old car was running. He never asks about the yard. He doesn't need to. I still sometimes wake in the deepest part of the night. The old habit is hard to break completely. But now, instead of checking the locks or peering out the window, I listen to the steady rhythm of Emily's breathing beside me. I feel the warm weight of Scout curled at the foot of the bed. The silence is just silence. The house is just a house. The dark is simply the absence of light, waiting for the sun to return. And it always does. The following autumn, a storm knocked down the old oak tree. It fell away from the house, its massive roots tearing up a section of the lawn near where the stone circle had been. The cleanup crew worked for 2 days, chopping the wood and grinding the stump. When they were done, there was a raw, muddy scar in the earth. Emily stood at the edge of it, her hands on her hips. "We'll plant a new one," she said. "A sugar maple. The leaves will be beautiful in the fall." We went to the nursery that weekend and picked out a young tree, its trunk no thicker than my wrist. We planted it ourselves, carefully settling its root ball into the fresh soil. As I packed the dirt around its base, my spade hit something solid. I carefully dug around it with my hands and pulled out a smooth, gray stone. It was one of the ones from the circle, buried deep by the falling tree. I held it for a moment, then carried it to the edge of the woods and dropped it among the ferns. It was just a rock. It had always been just a rock. The maple tree took hold. Its leaves turned a brilliant, fiery red that October. We took a picture and sent it to Jonathan. He texted back a single heart emoji. Life moved on, marked by these small, ordinary milestones. The past receded, not forgotten, but integrated. It became a part of our history, a story we could tell without the old weight of terror. We had not escaped it. We had absorbed it, and in doing so, we had rendered it harmless. The door was still there, in a way, but we had long since lost the key, and we had no desire to find it. We were too busy living in the rooms we had, filled with light. The year Jonathan turned 25, he brought his fiancée, Maya, to see the house. We showed her the photo albums and the garden, now expanded with a bed of flowers Emily had put in. We did not give her a tour of the shadows. We did not need to. She was a bright, practical woman who loved our son, and the house gave her no reason to feel otherwise. She admired the view from the kitchen window, the way the light fell through the leaves of the maple tree. She never once glanced toward the woods. After they left, Emily and I sat on the back porch. Scout, now gray-muzzled and slow, dozed at our feet. The sugar maple was tall and strong, its canopy casting a dappled shade over the entire area. You could barely see the faint difference in the grass anymore. The cold spot had faded to a memory, a ghost of a ghost. "He is happy," Emily said, her voice content. "He is," I agreed. We watched a butterfly, its wings a splash of orange and black, flit from one of Emily S. flowers to another. It danced on the air, a tiny, careless thing of beauty. It landed for a moment on the spot where the stone circle had been, then lifted off again, carried on a warm breeze. The past was not gone. It was simply quiet. And in its quiet, we had built a life that was full and real. The story was not over, but the frightening part was long behind us. The rest was just living. ERRORE. Storia 2, Non Generata Story 3. The first chill came on October 28th, a Tuesday. It wasn't the wholesome, crisp cold of an Ohio autumn, the kind that reddens cheeks. and makes the warmth of a kitchen feel like a sanctuary. This was different. I was in my bedroom, pasting a glow-in-the-dark skeleton onto my bedroom window, when I walked through a patch of air so frigid it stole the breath from my lungs. It was a pocket of concentrated winter, a column of air that had no business existing in my centrally heated house. It was the cold of a deep cellar, of wet stone, of something long buried. It lasted only a second, but the memory of it clung to my skin like a film. A premonition whispered directly into my marrow. I was 12, and I knew, with the absolute certainty children possess, about the hidden architecture of the world, that something was wrong with our town this Halloween. Our town, Hemlock Grove, was a postcard of Midwestern tranquility. But in October, it became something else. It transformed. Porches sprouted grinning jack-o'-lanterns, their candle-lit faces leering from the twilight. The trees, stripped bare in shades of crimson and burnt umber, clawed at a sky that turned a bruised purple too early in the afternoon. The air itself changed, carrying the sweet, melancholic scent of wood smoke and rotting leaves, undercut by the waxy, vegetal smell of scooped-out pumpkin guts. It was a season of masks, and not just the plastic ones hanging in the drugstore. The whole world felt like it was wearing a costume. I told Logan about the cold spot the next day after school. We were in his backyard, the damp earth soaking through the knees of our jeans as we surveyed the pile of pumpkins we deluded from a nearby patch. Logan, at 13, was our leader. He had a quiet gravity that made you believe he had a plan, even when he didn't. He listened to my story, his brow furrowed, his fingers tracing the grooves on a particularly large, lopsided pumpkin. Where exactly? He asked, his voice low. Between my bed and the door. It has gone now, but it was there. He nodded slowly, as if ID confirmed something he already suspected. Mom said the furnace at the old Hemlock Elementary is acting up again. Mr. Henderson from next door complained to the town council, said it was kicking on and off all night, making noises. Hemlock Elementary. The words landed between us with a heavy thud. The school had been closed for 20 years, since they built the new consolidated school on the other side of the county. It sat at the end of a long, leaf-choked lane, a hulking monument of red brick and boarded-up windows. Its playground was a skeleton of rusted metal, the swings moving in the wind with a lonely, grating shriek. We all knew the stories, of course. The usual kid stuff. A janitor who hanged himself in the boiler room. A teacher who never left. But they were just stories, the kind you tell with a flashlight under your chin to scare your friends. Until now. Mia and Sam joined us then, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Mia, small and fierce with eyes that missed nothing, immediately sensed the tension. What's wrong? Logan thinks the old school is involved, I said. Sam, loyal and built like a young ox, scoffed, but it was a nervous sound. That place, it's just a bunch of boards and dust. Probably raccoons. Raccoons that make the air freeze in my house, I countered. We fell silent, the only sound the dry rustle of cornstalks from the neighboring field, bundled and stacked like forgotten totems. The wind picked up, carrying a whisper that might have been our names. It was always carrying whispers in October. You learned to ignore them. This time, I couldn't. The following day, October 30th, the signs accumulated like storm clouds. The pumpkins on our porches began to rot at an impossible rate. One day they were plump and orange the next. They were collapsed in on themselves, their grins sagging into putrid, fly-blown grimaces. The candles inside them guttered and died, no matter how many times you relit them, filling the evening air with the acrid smell of spent wicks. My mother complained about the drafts in the house, wrapping her sweater tighter around her shoulders, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The town felt like it was holding its breath. The festive decorations, the synthetic cobwebs, the plastic skeletons seemed less like fun and more like a desperate attempt to ward off something we could all feel but not name. We were playing at fear, and something was deciding to play along. That afternoon, we found the first one. A small, vintage Halloween decoration, a cardboard witch with a bent conical hat and a grotesquely smiling face. It was pinned to the trunk of the great oak tree in the vacant lot where we played. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, the kind of thing our grandparents might have had. It was damp, as if it had been buried, and it was looking right at us. "That wasn't tea there yesterday," Mia whispered, her voice tight. Sam reached out to touch it, but Logan caught his wrist. "Dawn tea." We looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between us. The adults were no use. My father had laughed off the cold spot, blaming a drafty window. His skepticism was a solid, immovable wall. They saw a town preparing for a holiday. We were starting to see the strings behind the scenery, the ancient machinery grinding to life beneath the plastic and plywood. "We have to go," Logan said, his gaze fixed on the leering cardboard face. "To the school, tonight, before tomorrow, before Halloween." Didn't he have to say it? We all felt the deadline in our bones. The countdown was a clock ticking in the back of our skulls, each tick stripping away another layer of the normal world. The moon that night was a monstrous, swollen orange globe, a true harvest moon that painted the world in shades of tarnished silver and deep shadow. We met at the edge of the cornfield, our breath pluming in the air. We didn't need flashlights. The moon was enough. It felt like a spotlight. The dead leaves crunched under our feet, a sound like breaking bones, and they seemed to cling to our shoes, as if the ground itself was trying to hold us back. The wind carried voices, snippets of laughter from distant trick-or-treaters already practicing their roots. But the sounds were distorted, wrong, as if they were coming from the bottom of a well. We took the back way, through the skeletal corn maze that was the town's main attraction. In the daylight, it was a labyrinth of laughter and shrieks. Now, under the judgmental eye of that orange moon, it was a different place. The dried stalks whispered secrets as we passed, their shadows shifting to form grasping hands and gaunt faces. The path, which we knew by heart, seemed to change, leading us in circles until Logan, his jaw set, simply pushed through a wall of corn, creating a new, brutal shortcut. We followed, the rough leaves scratching at our faces, the smell of dry dust and decay thick in our nostrils. And then we saw it. Hemlock Elementary. It was a black silhouette against the star-pricked sky, a crouching beast. Several of the boards covering the windows were splintered, hanging loose like broken teeth. The air around it was colder, a deep, sinkhole cold that reached for us from 30 yards away. The smell was a complex cocktail of mildew, rotting paper, and something else, something metallic and coppery, like old blood. We slipped through a broken basement window, the space just wide enough for our 12-year-old frames. The darkness inside was absolute, a physical presence that swallowed the moonlight. We flicked on our flashlights. The beams cut through the gloom, illuminating a landscape of forgotten things. Small desks were piled in a corner, coated in a thick fur of dust. A forgotten alphabet chart hung crookedly on the wall, the letters blurred and runny from water damage. The floor was littered with shredded paper and the brittle carcasses of long-dead insects. And it was cold, so cold. Our breath plumed in the beams of our lights, and the chill seeped through our jackets, into our skin, down to our very bones. It was the same cold from my bedroom, concentrated and malignant. We moved as a single organism, a four-headed creature of fear, our shoulders touching. The silence was a weight, broken only by the scuff of our shoes and the frantic drumming of our own hearts. Then we heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, a scraping, followed by a faint, wet squelch. It was coming from the end of the hall, from the doorway that we all knew led to the boiler room. We inched forward, our flashlight beams dancing over the faded cinder block walls, over childish drawings that were now faded ghosts of themselves. The sound grew louder. Scrape, squelch, scrape, squelch. It was the sound of a shovel cutting into wet earth. It was the sound of something being dug up, or maybe something digging its way out. Logan pushed the boiler room door. It swung inward with a groan that seemed to tear the silence in two. The room was vast, a cathedral of rust and shadows. The great, dormant furnace squatted in the center like a sleeping god, and in the far corner, a figure was kneeling. It was indistinct, woven from the shadows themselves, a man-shaped void that absorbed the light from our flashlights. It was digging. Its hands, or what passed for hands, were plunged into the concrete floor as if it were soft clay, scooping out handfuls of black, loamy soil that should not have been there. Scrape, squelch. It stopped. It did not turn around. It did not need to. We felt its attention shift, a pressure settling on our chests, making it hard to breathe. The air grew colder still, so cold it hurt to inhale. Frost bloomed in intricate, fractal patterns across the rusted metal of the furnace. From the hole it had been digging, something began to rise. Not a body, not a ghost. It was a memory. A wave of sensation and image crashed over us, projected into our minds by the kneeling thing. We saw the school as it was decades ago. We saw a Halloween party, children in crude, homemade costumes laughing and bobbing for apples in a metal tub. We saw a teacher, a man with a kind, tired face, being teased, tormented by a group of older boys. We saw a ritual, not of play, but of cruelty. A mask, a cheap plastic monster mask, was forced onto his face, tied so tightly it cut into his skin. They had locked him in the boiler room as a prank, a Halloween joke. We felt his panic, the stifling heat, the way the mask sucked into his mouth with every terrified breath. We felt the moment the joke turned to tragedy, the moment the laughter on the other side of the door faded, and the real, profound silence of abandonment set in. The thing in the corner was still digging. It was digging up the pain. It was digging up the shame of the town, the secret that had been buried under new schools and fresh pavement and comfortable lies. The entity wasn't a ghost. It was the school itself, the land, made sentient and ravenous by a sustained diet of fear and a single, potent act of human cruelty. It had fed on that one man's terror for years, and now, on the one night when the veil was thinnest, it was hungry for more. The figure began to turn. It was a slow, deliberate motion, the axis of the world shifting. We didn't see a face. We saw the mask. The same cheap plastic monster mask from its memory. But now it was fused to something formless, something that pulsed with a dark, ancient life. The eye holes were not empty. They were windows into a cold, black star. We ran. We did not look back. We crashed through the hallways, our feet slipping on papers, our shoulders banging into lockers that rang out like funeral bells. The cold pursued us, a wave of winter at our heels, carrying with it the smell of turned earth and something sweetly rotten, like a Halloween pumpkin left to fester for a century. We burst out of the broken window, tumbling into the cold night air, and we did not stop running until our lungs were on fire, and the lights of our own houses were in view. On Halloween night, the town was a portrait of normalcy. Children in superhero and princess costumes flitted from door to door, their plastic pumpkins filling with candy. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed, laughter echoed, and parents stood in clusters, drinking cider. It was all a mask. We saw the truth beneath. We saw how the shadows from the flickering candles stretched just a little too long, how the laughter sometimes hit a wrong, hollow note. We saw the way the parents' smiles looked strained, their eyes darting into the darkness between houses. They felt it too, a primordial unease they chalked up to an overactive imagination or too much sugar. They were wrong. We didn't go out. The four of us sat in Logan's basement, the sounds of the holiday, a distant, mocking celebration. We had faced the secret heart of our town, and it had shown us its teeth. The bond between us, forged in that cold, dark place, was the only warmth we could find. It was our only weapon. The story doesn't end with a vanquished monster or a saved town. That's not how these things work. The next morning, November 1st, dawned gray and cold. The decorations came down. The rotting pumpkins were tossed into compost bins. Life moved on. But a week later, I found another one of those vintage cardboard decorations, this time tucked into the frame of my bicycle in the garage. This one was a leering black cat, its back arched. It was damp, and it smelled of wet earth. I showed it to Logan. He just looked at it, his face pale. "It's not over," Mia said, her voice barely a whisper. Sam, for once, had nothing to say. We never spoke of it to anyone else. What would we say? The adults would only see a piece of old cardboard. They couldn't feel the cold that still radiated from it. A cold that was now a part of our town, a part of us, sleeping deep beneath the foundations, waiting for the leaves to turn and the pumpkins to glow, waiting for the veil to grow thin once more. We had discovered the truth of Hemlock Grove, a truth that was never meant to be dug up. And the digging, we understood with a dread that would outlive our childhoods, had only just begun. The following spring was the wettest anyone could remember. The creek behind the school swelled, turning the vacant lot into a shallow, muddy lake. It was there, after the waters receded, that we found the next one. The mud had yielded up a small, rubber Frankenstein mask, the kind with the elastic string that always breaks. It was caked in dirt, one of the bolt-shaped plugs on its neck torn half off. It looked like it had been buried for 50 years. Logan poked it with a stick, turning it over. The hollow eye sockets were filled with mud, but we all felt it watching us. The ground around it was cold, even in the late April sun. We started seeing patterns where others saw coincidence. Old Mrs. Gable's dog ran away the night of a full moon. The new flowers planted in the town square wilted overnight, their petals turning black as if scorched by frost. A faint, coppery smell sometimes lingered in the municipal building, blamed on old pipes. We knew better. The thing under the school was not dormant. It was gardening, tending to the soil of our fear, planting seeds of unease that sprouted into small, inexplicable tragedies. We began our own watch. It was an unspoken pact. We mapped the cold spots. They were mobile, shifting through the town like a slow, invisible tide. One day the bench outside the post office would be too cold to sit on. The next, the entire produce aisle at the grocery store would carry a deep chill that made the lettuce wilt. We tracked them in a notebook, overlaying the patterns on a hand-drawn map of Hemlock Grove. The epicenter was always the old school, but the tendrils of its influence were stretching further, probing the town's foundations. One evening in July, with the fireflies blinking in the humid air, we were behind the old cinema, sharing a stolen pack of cookies. The back door to the projection booth was propped open, letting out the sounds of the movie inside. It was a comedy, and the audience's laughter roared out in waves. But with each wave of laughter, a corresponding wave of that familiar, cellar cold washed over us. The two sounds were tied together, the joy and the chill, one feeding the other. Mia hugged her knees to her chest. "It likes it," she whispered, her eyes wide. "It's feeding on it. All of it. The scares, the laughs, it's all the same to it. It's all energy. That was the moment we truly understood the nature of our enemy. It wasn't just a creature of fear. It was a creature of emotion, a parasite that fed on the heightened feelings of the town, with a particular taste for the dark and potent vintage of Halloween terror. The laughter from the cinema was just a different flavor on the same menu. The turning point came in late September. The air was starting to turn crisp again, and the first decorations were appearing in stores. Sam's younger brother, Leo, a cheerful first grader with a missing front tooth, came home from a birthday party with a goodie bag. Among the candy and toys was a small plastic skull that glowed in the dark. He loved it. He placed it on his nightstand. That night, and every night after, he had terrible nightmares. He woke up screaming, babbling about a man with a monster face who was digging in his closet. Sam told us, his face ashen. He described the mask, the one we saw. We knew we had to get it. We went to Sam's house, our hearts thudding. We made up a story about trading him a whole pack of baseball cards for the skull. Leo, tearful but tempted, finally agreed. The moment the plastic skull was in Logan's hand, a profound coldness seeped from it. It was a tiny focus, a battery charged by the thing at the school, and left to poison a child's dreams. We took it to the woods, to a place we considered safe, a small clearing we called the fort. Logan dug a hole with his hands. We didn't speak. We all knew what to do. We placed the skull in the earth, and as Logan covered it with dirt, Mia took a small bottle of lavender water from her pocket, a gift from her grandmother who believed in such things, and sprinkled it over the fresh soil. It was a gesture, a tiny act of defiance, a different kind of ritual. We looked at each other, our silent agreement deepening. This was no longer just about understanding. It was about protection. The thing under the school was spreading its toys, planting its anchors. It was preparing for Halloween, for its feast. And we were the only ones who knew. We were the only ones who could dig the right things up and bury the wrong ones deep. The war for Hemlock Grove had begun, and it was not a war of confrontation, but of quiet, desperate curation. The skull was the first thing we buried, but it wasn't the last. We became collectors of a grim and unwanted sort. Our afternoons were spent not at the playground, but patrolling the town's periphery, our eyes scanning the ground for misplaced relics. We found a tin noisemaker shaped like a bat, rusted silent, half submerged in the mulch of the city park. We found a cluster of wax fangs, still in their yellowed plastic case, tucked into the hollow of the historic oak on Main Street. Each object hummed with that same subterranean cold, a psychic residue that made our teeth ache. We developed a system. Logan was the spotter, his gaze unnervingly sharp. Mia was the handler, using a pair of her mother's gardening gloves to place the objects into a metal lunchbox we de-lined with salt. Sam was the digger, his small, quick hands efficient with the trowel we kept hidden in the fort. I was the lookout, my stomach a permanent knot of anxiety, always watching for adults, or worse, for other kids who might stumble upon our secret work. The week before Halloween, the town's excitement reached a fever pitch. The air itself seemed charged with a frantic, sugary energy. But for us, the festive atmosphere was a lie, a shimmering surface over a deepening rot. The cold spots on our map had multiplied, forming a near-perfect web across Hemlock Grove, with the old school at its center. The thing was not just preparing for a feast, it was weaving a net. On the night of October 30th, we knew we had to make one last patrol. The moon was a sharp, cold sliver, offering little light. We used our flashlights sparingly, their beams cutting nervous paths through the darkness. We checked all the locations on our map, the places where the cold had been most persistent. The bench, the grocery store, the cinema. They were all clear. A fragile hope began to bloom in my chest. Maybe we had done it. Maybe we had found all its anchors. We were on our way back, cutting through the overgrown field behind the post office, when Mia stopped dead. Do you hear that? We froze, listening. At first, there was only the wind hissing through the dry grass. Then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic crinkling. It was the sound of cellophane. Logan pointed his flashlight. The beam landed on a single, freshly wrapped piece of candy, a orange and black taffy, lying perfectly in the center of a patch of bare earth. It was pristine, untouched. It shouldn't have been there. Sam took a step forward. It's just a candy. Dante, Logan, and I said in unison. But it was too late. As we watched, another piece of candy, this one a lollipop, materialized in the air a foot above the ground and fell with a soft plop onto the dirt. Then another and another. They fell like a gentle, sickly rain, piling into a small, gleaming mound. It was a trap, a mockery of the treats that would be given out tomorrow night. A lure, and it worked. From the shadows behind the mound of candy, a small figure emerged. It was Leo, Sam's brother, his eyes wide and glassy, still in his dinosaur pajamas. He was sleepwalking, drawn here by the same force that had given him nightmares. Leo, Sam cried out, his voice cracking with terror. Leo, didn't he look at us? He stared only at the growing pile of candy, his hand outstretched. The air around him grew so cold that our breath crystallized into a thick fog. The grass at his feet began to frost over. We moved without thinking. Sam lunged for his brother just as Logan charged forward and kicked the pile of candy, scattering the bright wrappers into the darkness. The moment the pile was disrupted, the psychic pressure snapped. Leo blinked, looked around in confusion, and began to cry. The cold retreated, but not before we all felt it. A wave of pure, undiluted malice swept over us, so potent it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't angry that we had taken its anchor. It was angry that we had taken its toy. We got Leo home, shivering and sobbing, and concocted a shaky story about finding him sleepwalking near the road. His parents were too relieved to question it deeply. The next day, Halloween, the town was a riot of color and noise. But we saw the hairline fractures everywhere. We saw the way a perfectly carved jack-o'-lantern would suddenly gutter and die for no reason. We saw the groups of younger children hesitate at certain houses, inexplicably afraid to approach the door. The thing was no longer just waiting. It was tasting. That night, as the costumed hordes descended upon the streets, we didn't team meet in the basement. We stood together on my porch, watching the spectacle. We were the silent sentinels at our own party. We had buried its objects. We had broken its lures, but we hadn't beaten it. We had only managed the infection. The disease was still there, deep in the bones of the town, and it was learning. It knew our faces now. It knew we were the opposition. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, and the laughter of the children began to sound more and more like screams, we understood that our quiet war was about to get much, much louder. The last of the trick-or-treaters had vanished, their laughter swallowed by the night. Porch lights winked out one by one, signaling the official end of the sanctioned festivities. But the true Halloween was only now beginning. We watched from the porch as the town plunged into a deeper, more profound darkness. The streetlights seemed to struggle, their orange glow dimming, as if choked by an unseen fog. A new silence fell, heavy and expectant, broken only by the rustle of dead leaves skittering down the pavement like fleeing insects. Logan was the first to move, stepping off the porch and into the yard. He didn't look back at us. He just stared toward the center of town, his body rigid. "It's starting," he said, his voice flat. "The real show." We followed him, a silent procession of 4, leaving the safety of my house behind. We didn't need to discuss our destination. The pull was a physical thing, a cold thread tied to our sternums, reeling us in. We walked down the middle of the empty street, a place usually reserved for cars and playing children. Tonight, it felt like a processional road. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, carrying the cloying, overripe scent of 1,000 rotting pumpkins. The decorated houses we passed no longer looked cheerful. The grinning jack-o'-lanterns seemed to watch us with a predatory awareness, their flickering candle flames casting long, grasping shadows that twitched and writhed independently of the light. From inside one house, we heard a television blaring a sitcom laugh track, but the laughter was distorted, stretched into hysterical, sobbing wails that cut off abruptly. We turned onto Maple Street, and we saw it. A faint, phosphorescent glow was rising from the ground around the old school at the end of the road. It wasn't the clean light of the moon or a lamp. It was a sickly, greenish luminescence, the color of things that live deep underground. It pulsed slowly, in time with a low, subaudible hum that vibrated in our back teeth. Mia stopped, grabbing my arm. Her fingers were like ice. "It's awake," she whispered. "It's really awake." As we watched, the glow intensified, coalescing into shimmering tendrils that snaked up from the soil, weaving through the chain-link fence surrounding the school property. They were not made of light, but of concentrated memory and emotion. given form. We could see flickering images within them, glimpses of the Halloween party from its memory, the teacher's terrified eyes, the sneering faces of the boys, all playing out in a silent, looping nightmare. Then the ground itself began to change. The asphalt of the road in front of the school cracked with a sound like gunshots. From the fissures, not weeds, but twisted, thorny vines erupted, growing at an impossible rate. They were black and glistening, and they bore a grotesque fruit, plastic masks, rubber spiders, and tiny, grinning skulls, all glowing with that same sickly internal light. The thing was not just present. It was manifesting. It was decorating the town in its own image. A high, thin scream ripped through the night from a house to our left. It was followed by a door slamming shut and the sound of frantic sobbing. The thing was no longer just feeding on the ambient energy of the holiday. It was hunting. It was reaching into homes and plucking the fear directly from the minds of the sleeping, the unsuspecting. Sam let out a choked sound and pointed. On the school's roof, a figure had appeared. It was the silhouette of a man, but it was wrong, its limbs too long, its posture a broken angle. It wore the plastic monster mask, which now glowed with a fierce, malevolent green. It stood perfectly still, looking out over its domain, over us. We were not hidden. We were exposed in the middle of the street. We had spent the last year trying to contain this, to bury its influence. And we had failed. This was its full, unchecked power. This was Hemlock Grove's true heart, and it was beating a rhythm of terror that was shaking the town to its foundations. The war was no longer quiet. It was here, and we were standing on the front line, unarmed and utterly exposed to the gaze of the hungry, ancient thing we had awakened. The figure on the roof turned its head, the glowing mask fixed directly on us. There was no question. It saw us, knew us, remembered the taste of our fear from the basement. A wave of paralyzing cold washed down the street, so intense it felt like the air itself was freezing solid. My lungs seized. I couldn't breathe. Logan broke the spell. He didn't run. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was just a kid in a jacket, standing against a thing from under the world. But in that moment, he was the bravest thing I had ever seen. "You don't get him," he shouted, his voice thin and reedy against the oppressive silence. He was talking about Leo. The thing on the roof tilted its head. A low, grinding sound, like stone grinding on stone, echoed from the school. It wasn't laughter. It was something far worse. It was a sound of pure, amused contempt. The glowing vines snaking up from the ground suddenly lashed out. They didn't come for us. They whipped toward the houses on either side of the street, slithering up porch railings and drain pipes. The jack-o'-lanterns on those porches didn't just gutter out. Their carved faces twisted, the triangles for eyes and mouths stretching into wide, silent screams. The candles inside flared, not with orange flame, but with the same sickly green as the vines, casting a ghastly new light onto the manicured lawns. From inside one of the houses, a man's voice, confused and thick with sleep, yelled, "What in God's name?" porch light flicked on. The moment the light touched the vine crawling up his front steps, the bulb exploded in a shower of glass. The man screamed, a short, sharp cry of terror that was cut off as his front door slammed shut by an unseen force. It was hurting them. It was using the fear, amplifying it, and then using that amplified terror to push the townspeople deeper into their homes, into their panic. It was making them part of the ritual, their terror the final ingredient. Mia sank to her knees, her hands over her ears. "It's too loud," she sobbed. "I can feel them all. Their hearts are beating so fast." Sam was crying silently, his face a mask of helpless despair. We had tried to be curators, to clean up the mess. But this was a flood, and we were holding teaspoons. The figure on the roof raised one of its impossibly long arms. It pointed a single, bony finger not at us, but at the ground at our feet. The asphalt there began to bubble and soften like tar. Something was rising. Something was being dug up for us. A shape pushed its way up through the melting pavement. It was a toy, a simple, wind-up robot with chipped red paint. It was Leo's favorite, the one he'd lost in the park months ago. It stood there on the street, its key turning on its own with a slow, grinding whir. Then its head swiveled, its painted eyes locking onto us. It began to march forward, its little metal feet clacking against the road, a tiny, monstrous herald. It was a message. It knew our weaknesses. It knew our hearts. And it was showing us it could reach in and take anything it wanted. The war was louder now, yes, but it was also more personal. And as the little robot clattered toward us, we knew the battle for Hemlock Grove was about to be fought not in the streets, but inside of us. The robot stopped a few feet away, its key still turning with that agonizing, rusty sound. It was just a toy, a cheap piece of plastic and metal, but it felt more menacing than the glowing figure on the roof. It was a violation. It had been in Leo S. hands, had been loved, and now it was a weapon. Logan didn't he hesitate. He brought his foot down hard, crushing the robot into a mess of gears and broken plastic. The grinding noise stopped. The silence that followed was even heavier. On the roof, the figure lowered its arm. The contempt was gone, replaced by a new, chilling focus. We were no longer just pests. We were a challenge. The air began to change. The putrid pumpkin smell faded, replaced by a dry, dusty odor, like an old closet opened after decades. The flickering images in the glowing tendrils shifted. The Halloween party vanished. Now we saw flashes of other things. A tricycle left out in the rain. A single, tattered ballet slipper. A worn-out teddy bear with one button eye missing. It wasn't tea, just showing us our own fears anymore. It was rifling through the town's collective memory, pulling out every forgotten sadness, every tiny childhood grief. The energy it was feeding on was changing. The bright, sharp terror of Halloween was blending into something older, deeper, and more durable. Loss. A low, mournful wail began to emanate from the school. A sound that seemed to come from the very bricks. It wasn't a monster's roar. It was the sound of a child crying for something that can never be found. Mia lifted her head, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. "It's not just fear," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It never was. It's loneliness." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The basement, the isolation, the forgotten things. It wasn't just a creature of fear. It was a creature of abandonment. It had been alone in the dark for so long, and it wanted everyone to feel the same. Halloween was just the door it kicked open. Its true hunger was for the emptiness that comes after the laughter dies. The vines retracted, slithering back into the cracks in the earth. The glowing masks and skulls withered and fell to the ground, turning to black dust. The figure on the roof began to dissolve, not with a bang, but a sigh, the green light of its mask fading until it was just a vague, dark shape against the sky, and then nothing at all. The oppressive cold lifted. The streetlights brightened to their normal, mundane glow. The night was just a night again, but it wasn't over. We all felt it. We had seen its core. We had looked into the heart of the loneliness under the school, and it had looked back. It had shown us its true face. We stood there in the sudden quiet, shivering not from the cold, but from the understanding. We couldn't bury this. We couldn't curate it away. The war was no longer about fighting a monster. It was about confronting a void. And we were just 4 kids, standing at the edge of an abyss that had just learned our names. We didn't speak on the walk back to my house. The silence was a shared burden, heavier than any of the objects we had ever dug up. We had gone out to fight a ghost and found a wound. What do you do with that knowledge? How do you salt and bury a feeling? The basement felt different. The fort, our sanctuary, now seemed like a childish pretense. The map on the wall, with its web of cold spots, was just a symptom. We had been treating the rash, not the disease. Sam curled up in the old armchair, pulling his knees to his chest. Mia sat on the floor, staring at the salt-lined lunchbox as if it were a relic from a simpler, bygone era. Logan was the one who broke the silence. His voice was rough, stripped of all its usual bravado. "It's lonely," he said, echoing Mia's words. He wasn't looking at us. He was staring at the concrete wall as if he could see right through it to the school beyond. "It's just lonely." The word hung in the air, transforming everything. The malice we had felt, the cold, the terror, it wasn't random evil. It was the rage of something that had been left in the dark for too long. Its feasts were a desperate, twisted attempt to connect, to make the whole town feel the emptiness it lived with. "We can't fight it," Mia said, her voice hollow. "You can't punch a feeling." A new, chilling thought occurred to me. But it can fight us. It knows what Leo's favorite toy is. It knows how to get to us. We had thought we were protecting the town from an external threat, but the threat was internal. It was part of the town's foundation, a crack in its history that had festered. It knew our families, our homes, our secret fears. It had all the time in the world to learn. The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the high, grimy basement windows when we finally went our separate ways. There were no plans made, no new strategies discussed. We were adrift. The days that followed were the strangest of my life. November settled over Hemlock Grove, but the atmosphere didn't clear. The festive decorations came down, but a new tension remained. People were jumpy. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter on the walk to school. The cold spots on our map didn't disappear, they just shifted. They were weaker, more diffuse, but they were there. A lingering chill on a park bench, a sudden draft in the grocery store aisle. The thing was resting, digesting, but it was still watching. We tried to go back to normal. We did homework. We watched TV. But every quiet moment was filled with the memory of that lonely wail from the school. We had become antennas tuned to a frequency of sorrow that no one else could hear. The war was quiet again, but it had moved inside us. We were the battlefield now, and we had no idea how to surrender, or if we even should. The thing in the dark was lonely, and it had decided we were its company. A week after Halloween, I found my little sister's favorite doll sitting on my pillow. Its head was turned at an unnatural angle, and one of its glassy eyes was cracked. She hadn't played with it in years, but she'd never have broken it. I didn't tell anyone. I just put it in a trash bag and drove it to the dump myself. It was a message, as clear as the robot on the street. I am in your home. Logan called me that night. His voice, a tight wire of controlled panic. His dog, a grizzled old terrier who was afraid of nothing, had spent the entire evening whining and scratching at the basement door. When Logan finally opened it, the dog had refused to go down, its fur bristling as it stared into the darkness at something they couldn't see. Mia stopped coming to school. Her mom said it was a bad flu, but when I saw her through her bedroom window, she was just sitting on the edge of her bed, perfectly still, staring at the wall. She looked thin and pale, as if the life were being slowly siphoned out of her. She was the most sensitive, the one who felt everything the strongest. It was feeding on her. Sam was the one who finally said what we were all thinking. We were in my basement, not for a meeting, but because it was the only place we could be together without pretending. It's not trying to scare us away, he said, his voice quiet and defeated. It's trying to make us like it, isolated. It's cutting us off. He was right. The thing was a master of loneliness, and its strategy was to make us experts too. It was using our knowledge of it, our shared secret, as the very tool to pry us apart. The fear had been a warning. This felt like an invitation into a terrible, permanent quiet. I knew we couldn't last. We were fraying at the edges, being picked apart one by one. We had to do something, but the old rules were useless. You can't salt and burn a feeling. You can't bury a memory. But maybe, just maybe, you could answer it. The idea was insane, a leap into the dark so profound it made my hands shake. But it was the only thing left. That night, I didn't take a flashlight or a bag of salt. I took a single, old blanket from the linen closet, and I walked, alone, toward the school. I wasn't going to fight. I was going to talk. I was going to sit on the cold ground near the chain link fence, and I was going to acknowledge the lonely thing in the dark. I didn't know what would happen. Maybe it would consume me. Maybe it would just listen. But the silence between us had become a poison, and someone had to be the first to speak. The cold air bit at my face as I walked, and for the first time, I didn't feel the fear as an enemy. I felt it as a bridge. The playground was empty, the swings moving slightly in the wind like pendulums, counting down to nothing. I walked past them, my footsteps loud in the absolute quiet. The school loomed ahead, a dark slab against a darker sky. I could feel it waiting. It wasn't a presence of movement or sound, but a profound stillness, the quiet of a held breath. I stopped near the fence where the vines had been, the place where its heart had pulsed into the world. The ground was just ground again, the asphalt just asphalt. I unfolded the blanket, the wool scratchy and smelling of cedar from the closet, and I sat down. I crossed my legs and placed my hands on my knees, facing the school. I had no plan, no words prepared. I just opened myself up. I thought about Leo, about the crushing fear of losing him. I thought about the hollow ache in my chest when Mia didn't show up at school, and the cold dread of Logan's phone call. I let the loneliness I'd been fighting for a week, the loneliness it had been feeding me, rise to the surface. I didn't speak out loud. The words formed in my mind, a silent offering pushed out into the night. We see you. For a long time, nothing happened. The wind rustled a dead leaf across the blacktop. A car alarm blared faintly several streets away. I was just a kid sitting on a blanket in the cold, feeling foolish and terrified. Then the air directly in front of me grew cold. Not the aggressive, paralyzing cold from before, but a soft, localized chill, like the air in a room that has been closed up for a long time. The chain link fence began to weep. Not water, but a dark, viscous substance that dripped slowly from the metal links, each drop hitting the ground with a soft, thick sound. It was oil or something like it, and it carried the scent of old dust and forgotten birthdays. A shape began to form from the dripping substance, rising like a pillar of black smoke that refused to dissipate. It had no defined features, no mask, no limbs. It was a pillar of concentrated absence, a void given a rough, humanoid form. It stood there, shimmering slightly, and I felt its attention focus on me. It was listening. You are not alone, I thought, pushing the concept toward it, picturing my friends, our shared fear, our shared burden. We are here with you. The form rippled. A wave of emotion slammed into me, not as an image, but as a pure, raw feeling. It was the ache of decades, the silence of 1,000 empty nights, the bitter resentment of being forgotten. It was a loneliness so vast and ancient it threatened to swallow my own identity. I gripped the blanket, my knuckles white, and forced myself to stay open, to not build my mental walls. I let the desolation wash over me, through me. I accepted it. In return, I showed it my own small loneliness, the fear of being left behind, the the secret shame of not being enough. The quiet moments in a crowded hallway where I felt completely invisible. I showed it the four of us in the basement, a tiny island against its ocean of sorrow. The form shifted again. The bitter resentment softened, tempered by a flicker of recognition. It was a feeling so alien coming from this entity that it was almost shocking. It had known only the terror it could create. It had never been met with understanding, only with fear or attempts to destroy it. My simple, stupid act of sitting here and not running away was a language it had never heard spoken. A single, clear image formed in my mind, projected from the dark shape. It was the basement of the old school, but not as it was now. It was smaller, dirt-floored. A small boy in old-fashioned clothes was huddled in a corner, crying. He was hiding. He was afraid of the bigger boys, of the teacher. He had crawled into the darkest place he could find to be alone with his fear, and he had never crawled out. His loneliness had festered here, in this spot, for generations, feeding on every subsequent fear and sadness that seeped into the foundation. Growing into this, the image faded. The dark form began to recede, the pillar of void collapsing back into the oily substance on the ground, which then seeped into the earth, leaving no trace. The localized cold vanished. The night was just the night again. I sat there for a long time, shivering, my mind reeling. I had not defeated it. I had not banished it. But I had communicated. I had given it something other than fear to consume. I stood up, my legs stiff, and folded the blanket. The walk home felt different. The silence was no longer threatening. It was thoughtful. The war was not over, but the terms had just changed forever. We were no longer just its victims. We were its witnesses. And that, for now, had to be enough. The back door was unlocked. I slipped inside, the warmth of the house feeling alien and unwelcome. I crept upstairs, my body trembling with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. The image of the lonely boy burned onto the back of my eyelids. The next morning, I went to see Mia. Her mother let me in with a worried sigh. Mia was still in bed, but her eyes were open, and they focused on me as I entered. They were clear. "You went," she whispered. It wasn't an accusation. I just nodded, sitting on the edge of her bed. "It was so quiet for a little while," she said. The screaming in my head just stopped. "What did you do?" "I listened," I said, and I think it listened back. I told her everything. The blanket, the cold, the oily form, the boy in the basement. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, a single tear traced a path down her temple and into her hair. "He's just a lost little boy," she breathed. "We've been trying to fight a ghost, but we should have been looking for a missing person." By that afternoon, we were all in the basement again. The mood was different, charged not with fear, but with a grim, determined pity. I told them the whole story. Logan listened with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Sam chewed on his thumbnail, his eyes wide. "So it's a kid. Logan finally said, his voice rough. A sad kid who's been throwing a tantrum for 100 years. It's more than that, Mia said softly. It's the echo of that kid, amplified by every sad thing that's happened since. It's a wound in the world. The question is, Sam said, what do we do with a wound? You can't kill it. You acknowledged it, and that helped, but it's still there. It's still hungry. An idea began to form, fragile and terrifying. We can't cure it, I said slowly, but maybe we can help it move on. How? Logan asked. Throw it a birthday party. Something like that, I said, looking at each of them. We give it what it never got. We give it a proper goodbye. The plan was simple and insane. We would go back to the school, not with salt and iron, but with offerings. Things that represented comfort, safety, and closure. A small, impossible funeral for a boy who had been dead for a century. That night, we gathered our things. Mia brought a soft, hand-knitted scarf. Sam brought a small, smooth stone he said felt peaceful. Logan brought a worn baseball, something simple and honest. I didn't know what to bring. In the end, I took the old blanket I had sat on. It had been the first point of contact. We met at the playground as the last light bled from the sky. The school was dark and silent, but the watching feeling was back. It was curious. We walked to the same spot by the fence. Together, we laid our offerings on the ground. The scarf, the stone, the baseball, the folded blanket. We didn't speak. We just stood there, a silent vigil. The cold came, gentle and questioning. The air in front of us shimmered, and the dark, oily form began to coalesce once more. It was less defined than before, more like a smudge on the air. It hovered over our offerings. We poured every good memory we had into the space between us. Sleepovers, laughter, the solid comfort of friendship, the feeling of being seen and understood. We showed it that loneliness could end. The form drank it in. It trembled. For a moment, I saw him again, the boy in the old-fashioned clothes. He was no longer crying. He was looking at us, his expression one of profound confusion and a flicker of hope. Then he smiled. It was a small, shy thing, but it was real. The dark form dissolved, not into the ground, but into the air, dissipating like mist in a sudden, warm breeze. The cold vanished completely, replaced by the ordinary chill of a November night. A profound sense of peace settled over the playground, a quiet so deep and so clean it felt like a blessing. It was gone, not banished, not destroyed, released. We stood there for a long time, not needing to speak. The hole in the world had been filled. We picked up our now ordinary offerings, the objects just objects again, and walked home. The war was over. We had won not by fighting, but by caring. And for the first time since Halloween, the silence felt like peace.